Let's open our Bibles to John 20. 20th chapter of John is one of those transitional chapters that take us from the powerful moment of the crucifixion to the amazing moment where it starts to connect. Monday night we talked about following Jesus. And then we talked on Tuesday about seeing Jesus. That after you begin to focus your attention on where he's going and who he is, he reveals things to us. And it will test your fear. Seeing Jesus for who he is will show you who you are. And many times when you and I see ourselves in the reflection of Christ, we feel his love, but we see an iteration of ourselves that we don't like. We see this version of ourselves that we don't want to be. The world may accept it and our friends may tolerate it, but deep down inside there's a longing to be something different. It scares us. For some of us this week, you haven't dropped a rock ever because you're scared that you can't do it. You're just scared, and I understand. Jesus didn't play games. He said, if you're going to follow me, it's going to kill you. Come and die. Come and take up your cross and follow me, and you don't take a cross for symbolic purposes. You take a cross to die on it. And then we saw failure yesterday, and none of us had to argue with that. We've all disappointed ourselves, we've all disappointed God, and we've all disappointed people we love. Last night it was beautiful to see a number of you come down here and realize that, yes, I did this to him. One of the first steps of repentance is acknowledging who you said no to. And we saw our failure, but our failure strikes our pride. We don't want to admit what we do. We deny it, we soften it, we take away the rough edges, we explain it as a mistake, and our intentions were good, and we didn't know it would hurt, and yet we do it. Follow, see, fail. Today's word is trust. Trust is harder after you've begun to follow Jesus than it is before you follow him. Before you follow him, you think, yeah, I'm in. Once you begin to follow him, you realize Jesus isn't always what you thought he would be, and he always doesn't do what you want him to do. So how do we trust? I lived in a very, very tiny house with my family. At this time, there were only 3 of us, and I was the youngest, and we lived in this home, in this little tiny home my mom and dad could afford, and I drive by it, and I just remember it being so big. I remember walking in, there were 4 steps up to the front porch, and we used to play out on the porch in the summer and play in this little postage stamp front yard. And I remember walking in the front door. We had a big screen door. And I know we had a screen door because I got yelled at for slamming it too many times. Just bust open, run outside, and that door would slam. My mom would yell from inside, "Don't slam the door." It's a memory I had when I was just a peanut, 5, 6, 7 years of age. And we had a linoleum. That's an old statement. Some of you will look it up on Google. We had a linoleum floor. And when you walked in, that was always the ocean. Because to the right were steps that went up to the steps. And in this old house, there was no railing on the steps because my parents didn't love us. There were 4 of us. If one of us died, they still had 3. That's how I reasoned it. Now you couldn't build a house without a railing and a tarp and parachutes and firemen. But anyway, back then, we survived anyway. But there were 11 steps, I can remember them. 11 steps covered in shag carpet. Like big, deep, nasty shag carpet. It was the 70s. Everything was avocado colored or golden. It's coming back, just like the mullet. Anyway, so these steps were covered in shag carpeting, and there was the linoleum floor in the foyer. And then you went through one door and you went into the kitchen, and the other door went into the family room. And I remember being a little kid, the adventure was leaving the stairs and swimming. I would actually get on my belly and pull myself across the linoleum and swim to the island that was the living room. I know you don't care about this. Now let me tell you why I'm telling you that. Because it was in that house that I learned to trust. I learned to trust 2 people that I loved dearly, and I knew they loved me. But it really was a test. You see, my dad would come home from work, and he would take the 3 oldest of us boys, and he would set us on those stairs, and we would jump to him. My oldest brother, Steve, would get way to the top. He could get up to the 8th or 9th step and duck his head under the ceiling, and he would jump to my dad. My dad would catch you by the armpits and swing you around and take you to the island across the ocean. Man, I love that. And my brother Scott, who's 2 years older than me, would go up to about the 7th step. Scott was a little more, he's flat crazy, I'll be honest with you, just crazy. And if there was a 27th step, Scott would have gone to that first. And he would jump to my dad. And then there was me, the third, at that time the baby, scared to death. I wanted to do what the big boys did. I wanted to experience what they did. I heard how much they laughed, and I knew my dad loved me. My dad would put me on the 4th or 5th step. And one time I got really bold, and I went up to the 7th step. And my dad was standing right there, and he said, "Come on, buddy, jump." And I knew the man. I knew that man. He loved me. He played with me and wrestled with me, and when my 2 older brothers were mean to me, my dad would come in, he'd call himself the grizzly bear, he'd take both of my brothers, wrap them up, fire them into the couch, pile drive them, and land on them, and I got to come like pull their hair and snap their toes, and he was good to me. He really was. He was one of the best dads you could ever imagine. He would say, "Hey, come on, Mark, let's go," and I'd hop in his pickup truck, and he'd buy me a bottle of root beer, or back in the day, a glass bottle of Fresca. I know, look that up, it's good. And I would sit on the front seat with this glass bottle in a pickup truck with no seatbelt. I don't think he really loved me, honestly, because now he'd go to prison just for that. But I would sit there with my dad, and I loved my dad, and my dad would say, "Jump, Mark," and I can distinctly remember this. I'm not playing this up. I would dig my toes into that shag carpet so that you could see carpet coming between my toes. And I would reach out for my dad. And I'd say, "Just give me your hands." And my dad would smile, and he'd say no. And then he was cruel. He backed up. Closer I got to him, the further back he got. He said, "Come on, buddy, jump. I promise you I'll catch you." And I used to lean and do everything I could to stay on the stairs and reach my dad. My dad wouldn't allow it. And then he'd get frustrated. I got this from him too. He'd get frustrated, and he'd say, "I'm going to count to 3, and if you don't jump, I'll be done." And 1 was easy. 2 was fantastic. 3, I'd start to tremble. And I remember going, and he said, "Just push off." And at that time, my brother Scott behind me went. And like Peter Pan, I flew. And that dude caught me. I can remember to this day, he caught me by the arms. He swung me around and swung me around. And he took me to the island, and he dropped me off, and I was so happy. I ran across the ocean, got back on the stairs, and I dove. And we did this for the longest time. It might have been 5 minutes, but for a kid, it seemed like 4 hours. And I was diving off the top step, and he was catching me. And I remember my dad said, "Okay, boys, that's it." But I thought, one more. And I ran up on the steps, and I didn't see that he left. Yeah. So I learned who to trust and who not to trust, because the ocean was hard. And I landed, and my dad picked me up. "Are you okay, buddy?" And he carried me in, and we got a popsicle, and I remember I bumped my head, and I was like, "Ah." And then he looked at me. He's a smart dad. He took me back into that room, and he said, "Okay, one more." And he made me go back to the top after a failure, and I jumped. I am 52 years old, and I can tell you I remember being a 7-year-old like it was yesterday. It's one of those moments that impresses me. It's one of those moments I never want to forget. I sometimes, when we go back to South Bend, Indiana, we'll drive down Woodward Avenue to look at that old house. It is so tiny. When I was a kid, it was so scary and so big and so old. I'm going to tell you that if you follow Jesus, there are going to be moments you're going to have to let your toes off the carpet. Today's word is trust. It's a significant word. It certainly isn't easy. And you don't trust Jesus one time. You trust him every time. And there'll be moments that you're not going to want to do this. Jesus said, "It is finished." The consequences of sin, the damage of sin, the domination of sin, the threat of sin, the remembrance of sin. Jesus said, "It is finished." But now what? How do we live when sin has no more domination over us? When Satan can't run to God going, "You can't love her. She hates you. Look what she did. When you told her no, she said yes. And when you told him yes, he said no. You can't love them, God, because they don't love you." And Jesus said, "That is finished." And he died. Then he came to life. And that guy's looking at you saying, Come with me." And you're going to go, "Oh, man, I love that dude. I saw the 'it is finished.' I was there. My heart was moved. God, you did something in this room. You spoke to me. I heard you." And Jesus says, "Now come on. Now jump." And you say, "No, just come closer. Just get closer so I can make sure I can reach you." And Jesus said, "No, it's not about you reaching me. It's about you trusting me. If you pay attention to what Jesus is asking you to do, he'll change your life. If you expect to stay where you are, nothing will change. You're going to have to jump. But when you jump, oh my goodness, there's nothing else in the world like it. Just sometimes Jesus moves back. So it's not as easy as you thought it was going to be. There'll be days you're not very passionate to jump. You still need to jump. And there's days it's so easy you just fly. So what do? John 20 gives us a glimpse of how Jesus is going to meet you where you are, but he's not going to let you stay there. This is why we don't trust. You didn't trust on a Wednesday night at Move in 2017. You chose to trust on a Wednesday night at Move 2017, and then you have to make that same choice on Thursday, that same choice on Friday. You get it, right? Every day he's going to jump, and some days he's going to be further away from you than you want him to be, and you're not going to be able to reach him, and you're going to choose whether to stay on the stairs or fly. Look what he did to some disciples who didn't know how to move. John 20, verse 1. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb. This is after his death. She went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved. I want to pause the tape here for a moment. In verse 2, I want to correct what I think is a common misunderstanding. John never calls himself by name in the Gospel of John. Some of you know this, and some of you will read this and you'll think that John's a little arrogant. Like he's walking around going, of all the disciples, he loved me most. It's not what he's saying. John never calls himself by name, but he identifies himself in this story by simply saying this: I know he loved me. I know he loved me. I know that of all the things I did to him, he still loved me. So John says, in recording this, that Mary came back to he and Peter, and they said they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him. Mary was going to take care of the body. The way that they buried bodies in the days of Jesus was not like we do. There was no casket. The reason they used the tomb is they would wrap the body up with ointments and oils and all of these scented things so that the decay of the body wouldn't be so ghastly. They would wrap the body in these cloths, and they would lay them in tombs. You owned a tomb, but truthfully, you just rented one. Because a year after your death, or thereabouts, the family would open the tomb and take your bones and bury your bones in the ground. But they'd allowed your body to decay in the tomb. That's why they had family tombs. That's why if you find a tomb in that part of the world today, you won't find bodies in it, because they would remove the bones. And Mary is going to care for Jesus. And she runs back and says, the body is not there, and I don't know where they've put him. Verse 3. Now, if you pay attention to the scriptures, you're going to find some funny things that will make you chuckle. I see a few here. So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. Why would John record that? Because he's a dude. First of all, they ran. Okay, guys, everything's a competition. Second of all, John notes, just for the record, I won. 5, he bent over, he looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter, who was behind him, who lost, arrived and went into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there. Notice that John says, when I got there, I looked in, but Peter, being Peter, barged in. Peter actually went inside the tomb. And verse 7, as well as the burial cloth that had been around Jesus' head. The cloth was folded up by itself, separate from the linen. Now, my mother used this verse to say that if Jesus made his bed after he was resurrected, I should make mine before school. It's there. Use it if you will. Finally, the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, does anybody know who won? The disciple who reached the tomb first also went inside. He saw and what? He believed. This is interesting that John says, we didn't get this dude until I looked in the tomb and I saw the strips of cloth. If they would have stolen the body, they wouldn't have taken, who would take a dead body without leaving the covering on it? The Jews wouldn't have done that because it would have made them unclean. The Romans wouldn't have done that because they would have no need to. He said there was something about the strips of cloth laying there that what we wrapped his body in, he wasn't in that anymore. And John said it was at that moment that I believed in the resurrection. Verse 9, they still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. But John said, something happened to me there. Now jump down to verse 10. Then the disciples went back to their homes, but Mary stood outside the tomb crying, and as she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb. Now notice, Peter and John came in, they saw what they needed to see, and they bolted for home. And Mary, who is devastated, stays there. And she saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. And they asked her, woman, why are you crying? That's a dumb question. Seriously, if you're going to a grave, you shouldn't be whistling and dancing. Why are you crying? And she says, they've taken my Lord away, and I don't know where they've put him. At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. Verse 15, woman. Pay attention to what he calls her. Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you're looking for? Thinking he was the gardener, she said, sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him. I want you to notice the tone of voice. What I hear as I read this is this broken woman who's simply saying, don't play games with me. Don't play games with my heart. This is the guy that I bet my life on. And he's dead and they've stolen his body. Weren't they cruel enough to him to start with? Why couldn't they just let him remain dead? She doesn't even know who she's talking to. Look at verse 16. Jesus said to her, Mary. That's all he says. Just her name. He first called her woman. Now he identifies her. Mary. She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, teacher. Man, so much there. So now verses 17 through 23 take us to where Jesus begins to appear to the disciples. And he appears one time to the disciples. And the disciples realize who it is, and they're like, game changer. But one guy's not there, Thomas. And Thomas gets totally wrecked by preachers like me, doubting Thomas. This is the same guy who would look at Jesus one time when Jesus said, I'm going to Jerusalem. And Thomas is like, I'll go with you. Let's go die. He's not doubting Jesus. Verse 24, now Thomas, called Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, we have seen the Lord. But he said to them, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my fingers where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe it. Now you may say that Thomas is purely rational. He's saying, well, too much evidence against it. Stop. He saw what they did to Jesus. They didn't slap Jesus on the face twice, tie him up, and he died. He saw how they brutalized him. He saw how they tore open his body. He saw that his internal organs were exposed to the filth and the sweat and the heat. They saw him break down. The disciples saw what Jesus went through. It's not unreasonable for Thomas to say, there's more evidence to believe he could not be alive than that he is alive. What he's saying is, I need to see that what they did to that man didn't kill him. I think it's a fair question. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the door was locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you, which is awesome. Think about it. They're in a locked room. Why are they locked? Because they know that if the Romans find out where they're at, or the Jews find out where they're at, they're on the most wanted list. And Jesus doesn't walk through the door. He just shows up in the room. Peace. That'd freak you out, wouldn't it? It's like, oh my goodness. And he said to Thomas, put your hands here, or your fingers here. See my hands? Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. Thomas. Now notice this. Thomas never touches him. I believe that the reason Jesus went through the wall was to show that physically nothing stops him now. Thomas thought because of the way they brutalized him that there's no way he could be alive. And he said, really? This body that they killed just walked through a wall. Hello, peace. And he's like, Thomas, touch me. And Thomas is like, my Lord and my God. He doesn't need to touch him. He believes too. And Mary believes. Jesus told him, because you've seen me, you've believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. He's talking about us. I've never seen Jesus. I felt him. I think I'm learning to see him all around me. I've never felt him. I've never heard his voice. I know he's real. The reason I know he's real is that Holy Spirit we just invited into this place affirms in my heart all the time, because here's what Jesus has done for me. Jesus met me where I was. He met me on the edge of the steps. He met me with my feet just dug in, refusing to give up my safety. And he has, through time and answered prayer and some amazing people in my life. He's never showed up in a vision to me, but he will to some of you. He's never spoken to me where I've audibly heard his voice, but he may to some of you. But he's appeared to me in the most influential ways, and I know what it is to jump now. And sometimes it's scary, and sometimes it's hard, but trusting is not having all the evidence. Trusting is when you have enough evidence to jump anyway. Look what he did to these three. To Mary, he spoke her name, and she saw who he was. To Peter and John, these thinkers got evidence. The grave clothes in the empty tomb triggered in them some evidence that they needed to know that what he was saying came true. Thomas gets tactile proof. Jesus appears to Thomas, not in a vision, but he appears, and he speaks to Thomas. It'd be the same way he'll speak to the Apostle Paul when he appears in front of him as a great light on the road to Damascus. You see, what I want you to know is, if you trust Jesus, he's going to be outside of your reach. But he's going to meet you where you are, and he's going to give you what you need, and he's going to answer your concerns, and he may speak your name, or he may give you evidence from the resurrection in a very rational way, or he may appear to you in this powerful imagery. I'm here to tell you that if you are willing to trust Jesus, he will reveal himself to you, and it will scare the fire out of you. Jump anyway. Because he's worth trusting. And the only way you get the great experience is to trust him. You can't say to Jesus, I trust you, and never leap. You can't say, Jesus, I trust you, never get out of the boat. You can't say, Jesus, I trust you, never speak his name. You cannot say, I trust Jesus, and go back to a life that never needed to trust him. So for some of you, you have your life all mapped out, and Jesus is going to go, mm-mm. And for others of you, he's going to go, oh yeah, girl, go do that. For some of you today, he's going to put you at an intersection of life where you're going to have to respond in a moment, and you're going to have to trust Jesus. You have to believe that this man who died for your sins and said the domination of sin is over now has a better life for you to be lived, and it's all about faith and trust. Because trust is not having all the evidence. It's having enough evidence. And the evidence is what I told you yesterday. Who is he? What did he do? And what does he promise to do? That's a guy you launch toward. That's a guy you pursue. And have no doubt, as scary as it is, he will catch you. He will provide. Let's watch this video.